Jack Morris carried the shame of a dishonorable discharge for 40 years, unaware it was the result of a deliberate betrayal. Major Robert Hanley, a respected officer, had stolen funds meant for wounded soldiers and ruined lives to cover his crimes. But fate intervened when Scout, Jack's loyal dog, uncovered a hidden safe that revealed the truth. Just listen to how shocking the turn of events in this drama was, and why justice ultimately prevailed. The old farmhouse creaked like an aging ship in the wind. Every gust that swept across the Oregon Valley seemed to carry with it the memories of another time. Voices that once filled the kitchen, boots that once thudded across the porch, laughter that had long since faded. Jack Morris, 62 and weary in more ways than one, stood in the middle of the empty living room, the smell of rain drifting through the cracked window frame. After years of city life that felt more like survival than living, he had returned to this place, a house that had seen his first steps and his last goodbyes. It wasn't comfort that brought him back. It was necessity. His savings were running low, and the farmhouse, though old and stubborn, was all he had left. Only Scout, his German shepherd, seemed to breathe life into the place. The dog had been rescued from a shelter 3 years ago, nervous and thin, but loyal beyond measure. Now Scout followed Jack everywhere, through the fields, to the shed, even to the quiet graveyard behind the barn where Jack's parents rested. It was a gray, wet afternoon when the strange thing happened. The rain came down in steady sheets, drumming against the tin roof, turning the fields outside into mirrors of mud. Jack was in the kitchen, oiling the hinges of an old cabinet, when Scout began barking, sharp, insistent, almost frantic. "At ease, boy," Jack said, setting down the rag. But the dog wouldn't stop. The barking grew louder, echoing through the narrow hall, drawing Jack toward the staircase that led up to the attic. Scout was already there, paws pressed against the door, tail stiff with alert. Jack sighed. "What now, partner?" he muttered, opening the attic door. The smell of dust and cedar hit him instantly. The air was thick, untouched for years. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering as he pulled the chain. Scout darted forward, nose to the ground, weaving through stacks of boxes and old furniture draped in sheets. Then he stopped suddenly at the far end, near the window that looked out onto the orchard. He started pawing at the floor, whining low, like something down there demanded attention. Jack crouched beside him. The wooden planks were uneven, and one corner was slightly raised. "You've got a nose for trouble," he said softly, though curiosity had already taken hold. Using a small crowbar from a nearby crate, he wedged it beneath the board and pried it up. The sound of nails giving way echoed through the attic. Beneath the plank was a hollow space lined with insulation and dust. Inside, almost hidden, was the edge of something metal. Jack brushed away the grime, and as the shape took form, his pulse quickened. It was a safe, square, heavy, and rusted over with time. No markings, no label, just cold steel staring back at him from the shadows. Jack sat back on his heels. The room felt suddenly colder. "What in the world?" he whispered. He tried to lift it, but it barely moved. The lock was sealed, the hinges corroded. His father had never mentioned anything like this. There were no notes, no clues, no key in sight. The idea that his father, a man of few words and rigid habits, had hidden something here unsettled him. That evening, Jack sat by the fireplace, the storm still muttering outside. The safe was downstairs now, placed on a tarp near his workbench. He couldn't stop looking at it. It felt out of place, like an intruder that didn't belong to the family history he knew. He poured himself a cup of black coffee, staring at the safe's dull surface as if it might answer him. His mind raced through possibilities, old tax records, war keepsakes, maybe even his father's savings. Yet something deeper, quieter, whispered that it was none of those things. Scout lay beside him, eyes half closed but ears alert. Jack reached down, resting a hand on the dog's head. "You've found something, haven't you?" The dog gave a low hum of acknowledgement, as if agreeing. That night, sleep wouldn't come. The sound of rain became a steady rhythm against the roof, but Jack's mind refused to quiet. He turned in bed, replaying memories, his father's silence about the war, the look in his mother's eyes whenever his father spoke too sternly, the way certain boxes had been sealed and never opened after the funeral. It wasn't just curiosity that kept him awake. It was a feeling he couldn't name, a sense that the house itself had been holding its breath for years, waiting for someone to lift the floorboards and let the past see daylight again. And down in the workshop, in the dim glow of the lamp, the rusted safe sat in silence, holding within it something that would soon turn Jack's quiet return home into a story the entire country would talk about. For 3 long days, the safe tested both Jack's strength and his patience. Each morning, he returned to it with renewed determination, armed with tools, grit, and an ache he couldn't quite name. The rusted hinges refused to yield at first, groaning with every strike of the hammer, as if they meant to guard their secrets until the end of time. Scout stayed nearby the entire time, head tilted, tail resting still on the floorboards. Jack worked in silence except for the metallic clatter that echoed through the empty farmhouse. His hands grew raw, his knuckles bruised, but he couldn't stop. Whatever his father had hidden up here, it mattered. On the 3rd afternoon, as the rain began once more to sweep across the fields, the safe finally surrendered. The lid gave way with a sudden hollow clang, a sound that filled the attic and seemed to linger long after it faded. Dust lifted into the air like smoke, catching the dim light from the attic bulb. Jack leaned in, heart pounding. Inside lay a stack of documents, yellowed with age, bound in a worn folder. Next to it, a handful of black and white photographs tied together with twine, and at the bottom, a small wooden box, the U.S. Army insignia carefully carved into its lid. He swallowed hard. "Well, Dad," he whispered, "let's see what was worth hiding." He reached for the folder first. The paper felt brittle beneath his fingers. The top document was a typed letter, its edges torn and corners curled. The words across the top made him blink twice to be sure he read them right. To U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, confidential. There was no signature, but the contents, they hit him like a blow to the chest. The letter accused Major Robert Hanley, Jack's former commanding officer during his final deployment, of diverting funds meant for wounded soldiers. It went further, describing how Hanley had falsified reports, framed subordinates, and arranged dishonorable discharges for anyone who asked too many questions. Jack's breath caught. He turned the page, scanning the lines again, faster now, as though he could rewrite the past by reading quicker. But there it was, clear as daylight, his own name among the listed soldiers. The attic blurred for a moment as the memory struck him like lightning. The hearing room, the sharp tone of the officer reading his charges, the disbelief in his own voice as he tried to defend himself, the shame that followed him home, the neighbors' looks, the years of silence from those who once called him brother. He clenched the papers in his hands. "It was all a lie," he whispered. Scout shifted closer, sensing the tremor in his voice. Jack forced himself to look through the photographs next. Each one was grainy, taken decades ago. Soldiers in uniform, tents in the background, familiar faces he hadn't seen in years. Then, in the last few images, the truth revealed itself like a wound reopening. There was Hanley, young, confident, smiling for the camera beside duffel bags of cash stacked in neat piles. Another photo showed him shaking hands with a civilian whose face was half in shadow. On the back of one photograph, in neat cursive, someone had written, "Keep quiet, or they'll come for you too." Jack set the pictures down, his pulse unsteady. His hands moved to the wooden box next. The hinges creaked as he opened it. Inside were two objects, a pair of dog tags, tarnished but readable, and a folded note written in a familiar trembling hand. Jack unfolded it slowly. The paper was thin, the ink faded but legible. "I found this after you left, Jack. I didn't know how to fix it. Hanley paid me to keep quiet. I'm sorry, son." The words blurred as he read them again, disbelief tightening in his chest. His father, his quiet, steadfast father, had known. He hadn't just known. He had accepted payment to remain silent while his own son's name was dragged through the mud. Jack's breath came shallow. The attic felt smaller with every second, the walls pressing in as if the house itself could feel his grief. The rain outside had turned fierce, hammering against the windows. Scout whined softly, resting his head on Jack's knee. He sat there, motionless, staring at the note until his hands began to tremble. Every piece of the puzzle, the silence, the unfinished conversations, the way his father never looked him directly in the eye after he came home, all of it fell into place. Betrayal had a strange weight. It wasn't loud or sudden. It was quiet, steady, and suffocating. Jack pressed the dog tags against his palm and shut his eyes. "I trusted you," he whispered into the stillness. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley, and the light flickered once, casting shadows that danced across the attic walls. In that moment, Jack knew his past hadn't been buried by time. It had been locked away, waiting for him to find it. And now that he had, nothing about his life or his father's memory would ever be the same again. Jack sat at the kitchen table, the morning light thin and gray, coffee cooling in his mug. The note and photographs lay spread before him like pieces of an accusation he had carried silently for decades without knowing it. What began as grief for his father's betrayal now burned inside him as a white-hot rage. For years he had lived under the shadow of dishonor. For years he had begged, pleaded, filed appeals, and received nothing but silence in return. And now, here it was, the proof, the letter, the photographs, the names, the truth. The shame had not been his. It had been stolen, and so had his life. Jack pushed back from the table. Scout, lying at his feet, lifted his head, ears alert. Jack spoke quietly, but with resolve. "It's time." He gathered the documents carefully, placing them in an old leather satchel. He drove into town that morning to the modest office of Lydia Price, a local journalist with a reputation for exposing stories no one else dared touch. Lydia had a sharp gaze, a voice that carried conviction, and a commitment to truth that matched Jack's own. When Jack laid the folder on her desk and opened it, her expression shifted instantly. The room seemed to still, her eyes scanning the documents, then the photographs. She looked up at Jack, her jaw set. "This," she said quietly, could blow open one of the biggest military cover-ups in decades. Jack felt a rush of vindication mixed with a cold bitterness. "They took my life from me," he said. "It's time they paid attention." Within days, Lydia's report was live. It spread like wildfire. The headline hit national news. "Retired Veterans Discovery Exposes Massive Cover-Up in Army Records." The reaction was immediate. Veterans groups rallied behind Jack. Social media ignited with both outrage and support. And at the center of the storm was one name: Major Robert Hanley. Hanley, now a respected defense consultant living comfortably in Virginia, responded quickly. He called Jack's claims a fabrication. In a press release, Hanley dismissed him as a washed-up nobody chasing ghosts. But the words fell flat against the growing weight of evidence. Soon, more voices came forward. Soldiers, once silenced, stepped into the light. Testimonies emerged of dishonorable discharges, lost benefits, broken lives, all connected to the fraud Jack had uncovered. The story snowballed into a full-scale investigation. But Jack became more than just a whistleblower. He became a target. Trolls and critics flooded his inbox. Social media attacks accused him of seeking fame, of exploiting tragedy. Yet the voices of veterans, those who knew the sting of betrayal, called him something far different. The man who finally cracked the silence. For Jack, the noise was both exhausting and inevitable. Still, he pressed forward. Every article, every testimony, every interview became a small victory. But the fight had cost him something deeper: peace of mind. Through it all, Scout was there. Always. At his side during interviews, on long walks through the orchard, in the quiet nights when Jack lay awake replaying every moment of his service, every injustice he'd suffered. Then came the threats. Emails with no return addresses, notes slipped under his door, calls that went unanswered when he answered them. The danger became real. Jack felt it, not with fear, but with fierce resolve. One evening, after locking up the farmhouse, Jack went to the closet where his old uniform hung folded neatly. His fingers brushed the fabric, worn from years of service, the weight of medals and duty stitched into it. Scout padded quietly beside him. Jack looked down at the uniform, then at the dog who had never left him through this storm. His voice was steady, low. "They took my honor once. They're not taking it again." Scout gave a soft whine, resting his head against Jack's boot, as if agreeing. Outside, the wind picked up. The farmhouse seemed to lean into the storm, as if bracing itself. And Jack, for the first time in years, felt a dangerous clarity. The fight was no longer about clearing his name. It was about something far larger. Justice for every soldier who had been silenced. And he would see it through. Months passed in a blur of interviews, testimonies, and mounting evidence. Jack had grown accustomed to the storm that followed him everywhere. In headlines, online forums, even in passing conversations at the grocery store. But beneath the noise, there was a steady pulse of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Finally, it came. The announcement arrived early one autumn morning. Jack sat in his living room with Scout resting quietly at his feet when the phone rang. Lydia's voice was calm but carried the weight of confirmation. "They've released the report," she said. "Hanley's been found guilty." "It's over." Jack felt a strange stillness settle over him. He pressed the phone to his ear, hearing her words, but it was as if they were distant, filtered through the years he'd spent waiting for this day. The Department of Justice's report was damning. Major Robert Hanley had orchestrated one of the largest embezzlement schemes in recent military history. Funds intended for wounded soldiers had been diverted, reports falsified, and subordinates, including Jack, had been dishonorably discharged to cover the trail. Hanley was stripped of all his military honors and sentenced to prison. For Jack, the official clearing of his record felt almost unreal. 40 years had passed since his court-martial. The Army sent him a letter of apology, and a formal ceremony was held to reinstate his name to the Wall of Honor at the Veterans Memorial. Cameras flashed, veterans stood at attention, and applause rang out. Yet when the applause faded, Jack felt something different from triumph. He felt light, free. That afternoon, he returned home to the farmhouse. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves. Scout padded behind him as he climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, the place where this entire journey had begun. The old beams creaked under his boots, the air still heavy with the scent of dust and memory. He opened the attic door and stood quietly in the pale afternoon light. For a long moment, he simply looked around. This had been a room filled with secrets and shame. Now it was a space emptied of them. At the mantel in the living room, Jack placed his father's dog tags beside Scout's collar. He ran his fingers over the metal, the letters worn but unmistakable. The two pieces of metal, one belonging to a father who had tried, in his own flawed way, to protect his son, and the other to a loyal companion who had never left him, seemed to tell a story more complete than any headline. Jack whispered softly, as if speaking to both of them, "You tried to protect me, old man." You just didn't know how Scout lifted his head, meeting Jack's gaze, and rested it back against his leg. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint hum of the valley below. That evening, Jack sat in his favorite armchair. The television was still on, showing news coverage of the trial and verdict, his name scrolling across the ticker. Scout curled at his feet. Jack reached down, stroking the dog's head, and turned the TV off. Silence filled the room. For the first time in years, there was peace in Jack's house. Not because the world had apologized to him, but because the truth had finally come home. He thought about the long road, the betrayal, the years of unanswered questions, the battles fought in public and private. The justice he'd been given was long overdue, but it brought something more than vindication. It brought closure. And in that moment, Jack realized something important. The real victory wasn't in clearing his name or seeing Hanley punished. It was in reclaiming his own peace. The attic, once a place heavy with dust and secrets, had lost its weight. Jack closed the door quietly. Scout padded to his side, and together they stepped into the warmth of the living room. Outside, autumn light spilled softly over the old farmhouse. The chapter was closed. The truth was no longer hidden, and at last Jack could rest.